Imagine standing behind towering stone walls, while an enemy army surrounds you on every side. Siege engines roar, arrows darken the sky, and survival depends on every clever trick and brave soul inside. This was the brutal reality of life in a medieval castle under siege. In today's story, discover how castles turned into fortresses of cunning and courage, from hidden passageways and deadly traps to heroic defenders and strategies that shaped history. Before we dive deep into this world of stone and steel, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe for more incredible historical stories, and let us know where you're watching from in the comments. Now, let's step behind the walls and begin the story of how medieval castles defended against invaders. The castle stood like a silent sentinel on the horizon. Its stone towers pierced the sky, watching over the land in every direction. At dawn, when the sun burned off the mist from the nearby forest, its high curtain walls seemed almost aglow, a symbol of power and, most importantly, protection. For those inside, the walls were security. For those outside, they were an obstacle, a deadly puzzle that only the bravest or most foolish dared to solve. In medieval Europe, castles were more than just homes for lords and royalty. They were fortresses, built with one unrelenting purpose: to withstand siege. The age of chivalry was also the age of relentless warfare. Rival lords fought for land, kings clashed for crowns, and foreign invaders often brought chaos to otherwise peaceful lands. Castles, therefore, were the line between survival and destruction. It all began with location. Choosing where to build a castle was a decision that could decide the outcome of future wars before the first stone was even laid. Builders selected elevated ground whenever possible. Hills and rocky outcrops offered a natural advantage, forcing attackers to fight uphill, exhausting and exposing them. Rivers or moats could be used to limit the approach, making the castle an island of stone surrounded by deadly waters. But the walls themselves were the first true line of defense. Thick, towering, and often slightly curved, they were designed to withstand siege weapons like battering rams and catapults. Archers stationed along the parapets fired arrows down on anyone who ventured too close. Reticulations, stone projections with holes in the floor, allowed defenders to drop rocks, boiling water, or burning oil onto attackers below. These were not just walls. They were lethal obstacles that punished every step of the invader's advance. Gatehouses and drawbridges became the focal points of defense. Unlike simple gates, these structures were fortresses within fortresses. As invaders approached, they were forced into narrow passages where they became easy targets for archers and crossbowmen. The portcullis, a heavy, iron-spiked gate, could be slammed down in seconds, trapping enemies in the killing zone between two walls. Murder holes in the ceiling of the gatehouse allowed defenders to pour destruction onto the trapped attackers. Yet the threat was not only from brute force. Siege warfare was a slow and brutal affair. Invaders might surround a castle, cutting off supplies in hopes of starving its occupants into submission. To counter this, castles were designed for self-sufficiency. Wells dug deep into the earth ensured fresh water. Storage rooms, often in the deepest, coolest parts of the keep, held grain, salted meat, and dried vegetables, enough to last months, even years. In times of war, entire villages would retreat behind the walls, turning the castle into a bustling, desperate town. Beyond these practical defenses, there was strategy. Castle defenders used deception and surprise to break sieges. Secret tunnels, sometimes known as sally ports, allowed knights and soldiers to launch sudden counterattacks or sneak out to destroy enemy siege engines under the cover of night. Fire ships, disguised envoys, or even bribery could be employed to disrupt the enemy from within. In the medieval world, every castle had its own unique story of resistance. Some fell in hours, others stood defiant for years, breaking the spirit of entire armies. No two sieges were ever the same, yet they all followed the same grim pattern. For the defenders, survival meant turning every stone, every arrow, and every moment into a weapon. As the sun dipped behind the walls and torches flickered to life, defenders on the ramparts knew the night could bring anything, from the whistling cry of arrows to the roar of siege towers rolling through the darkness. Their castle was ready. As warfare evolved, so too did the weapons used to breach mighty castle walls. For every defensive innovation, attackers answered with more terrifying engines of destruction. The medieval battlefield became a deadly arms race, and castles often became proving grounds for the latest and deadliest siege technology. One of the earliest and simplest weapons used against castles was the battering ram. Though rudimentary in design, it could devastate gates and weak points in stonework. Attackers would often shield the ram with a wooden structure covered in animal hides soaked in water. This prevented defenders from setting it alight. As the ram smashed rhythmically against the gate, the defenders above fired arrows and hurled rocks, hoping to kill or drive away the men below. But brute force alone was often not enough. The invention of siege towers allowed armies to assault the battlements directly. These massive, mobile wooden structures were built to match, or even exceed the height of castle walls. Covered in wet hides to resist fire, siege towers rolled forward on wheels, their platforms packed with soldiers eager to pour onto the walls. Defenders fought desperately to repel these threats, using catapults or fiery projectiles to ignite them before they could reach the castle. Among the most feared siege engines was the trebuchet, a marvel of medieval engineering. Unlike simple catapults, trebuchets used counterweights to hurl massive stones with terrifying force and accuracy. Some could launch projectiles weighing hundreds of pounds over vast distances. Walls that once stood unbreakable trembled under repeated strikes. In addition to stones, trebuchets sometimes hurled rotting animal carcasses or incendiary materials to spread disease and chaos within the castle. Meanwhile, ballistae, giant crossbow-like machines, fired massive bolts capable of impaling multiple enemies at once or smashing through wooden gates and fortifications. For defenders on the walls, every clang and creak of enemy engines signaled imminent danger. By the later Middle Ages, the arrival of gunpowder forever changed the nature of siege warfare. The introduction of early cannons, called bombards, posed an existential threat to castles. These crude but powerful weapons fired stone or iron balls capable of shattering walls in ways previously impossible. Although primitive, bombards marked the beginning of the end for traditional medieval castles. Faced with these escalating threats, defenders adapted. Castle walls, once built tall and thin, became lower and thicker to absorb the shock of projectiles. Engineers added sloping faces or angled bastions to deflect cannonballs. Concentric castles, featuring multiple layers of defensive walls, became more common. If attackers breached the outer wall, they faced another, and another, each bristling with defenders. Defenders also improved their use of arrow slits, or embrasures, narrow vertical openings through which archers could fire safely. These slits were cleverly designed, wide on the inside to allow movement, but extremely narrow on the outside to make it nearly impossible for enemy archers to return fire. During sieges, defenders employed all available resources to delay, disrupt, and demoralize their attackers. Boiling oil, though rare due to its cost, gave way to more common alternatives like heated sand or water, which could be poured through murder holes onto attackers attempting to scale the walls or break through gates. In winter sieges, defenders sometimes waited for freezing weather, pouring water onto ladders and siege equipment to create sheets of ice, making them deadly to climb. Siege warfare was more than a battle of strength, it was a contest of will and ingenuity. Every new assault forced defenders to respond with equal cunning. In the endless game of attack and defense, the castle was as much a weapon as it was a shield. Its walls, towers, and defenders formed a living organism, reacting and adapting with every strike. For those within, holding out was the only path to survival. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, but the walls still stood. In the shadows of fire and steel, hope endured. As impressive as walls and weapons were, castles did not defend themselves. Behind every arrow slit, atop every tower, and within every courtyard stood people, the true heart of the defense. Knights, men-at-arms, archers, and even townsfolk played vital roles in resisting invaders. In times of siege, a castle transformed from a grand residence or administrative hub into a tense and desperate fortress, where every person, no matter their station, was essential. The garrison of a medieval castle was often carefully planned. Permanent soldiers, including knights and professional men-at-arms, made up the core of the defenders. These men were well-trained and heavily armored, prepared for battle at a moment's notice. During peacetime, they drilled regularly, patrolled the walls, and maintained weapons. When war came to their gates, their discipline proved invaluable. Supporting them were the archers and crossbowmen. Archers, often recruited from surrounding lands, played a crucial role during sieges. From their elevated positions along the ramparts, they rained down deadly volleys of arrows on enemy soldiers attempting to scale the walls or approach siege engines. Crossbowmen, though slower to reload, packed a more powerful punch and could pierce armor, making them vital when facing heavily armored attackers. But defenders were not always seasoned warriors. When danger loomed, every available hand was called upon. Blacksmiths sharpened weapons and repaired damaged armor. Masons and laborers patched breaches in the walls, often under fire. Peasants and townsfolk hauled supplies, carried water, and tended to the wounded. Women and children, though usually sheltered deep within the keep, contributed where they could, sometimes boiling water or preparing stones to be dropped through murder holes. Inside the walls, life during a siege was grim. Supplies became precious almost immediately. Rationing was strict, with grain, salted meat, and dried vegetables doled out carefully to avoid starvation. Wells provided fresh water, but if attackers poisoned them or cut them off, defenders had to rely on stored rainwater or cisterns. Disease, worsened by crowded conditions and poor sanitation, was often as great a threat as the enemy outside. Morale became a critical factor in survival. Castle commanders, often noble lords or experienced knights, took responsibility for maintaining order and hope. They led prayers, organized entertainments such as music or storytelling, and made public displays of confidence, walking the ramparts to be seen by their people. When days turned into weeks and the enemy showed no signs of relenting, these gestures could be the difference between unity and collapse. Psychological warfare was common. Attackers sometimes catapulted gruesome missiles, the bodies of fallen comrades or diseased animals, into the castle to spread fear and sickness. In turn, defenders hung the bodies of captured enemy soldiers from the walls as warnings or taunts. Both sides understood that victory in a siege was as much about breaking spirits as breaking walls. For the defenders, night was the most terrifying time. Torches burned low, shadows stretched long, and the sounds of invaders digging tunnels or moving siege engines echoed ominously. Soldiers took shifts patrolling the walls and watching for signs of an assault. The ringing of alarm bells could erupt at any moment, sending exhausted defenders rushing to their positions. And yet, in the midst of terror and exhaustion, camaraderie flourished. Shared hardship forged bonds. Soldiers joked between attacks, families comforted each other, and prayers rose together into the night. As the siege dragged on, these moments of unity became lifelines, keeping despair at bay. The human spirit, fortified by stone and steel, was perhaps the greatest defense of all. Though castles could be battered, starved, and surrounded, as long as the people within refused to surrender, the walls still held meaning. Defense was not only about brute strength or endurance, it was also about outsmarting the enemy. Medieval castles were masterclasses in clever design and psychological warfare. Behind the stone walls lay traps and deceptions crafted to frustrate, confuse, and destroy invaders before they could ever breach the inner sanctum. From the very moment an enemy army approached, they were manipulated. The winding and narrow approach roads leading up to castles were often intentionally designed to slow attackers. These paths twisted and climbed steeply, forcing invaders to move in tight formations under a hail of arrows from above. It also made it difficult for siege engines to be wheeled into position, giving defenders critical time to prepare. Gatehouses, the literal gateways into castles, were among the most dangerous places for attackers. Beyond the outer drawbridge and main gate lay the murder zone, a small courtyard enclosed by thick walls and topped with openings called murder holes. Should an enemy force manage to break through the main gate, they would find themselves trapped here. From above, defenders poured boiling water, sand, rocks, or even quicklime down through the murder holes, turning this confined space into a killing ground. Portcullises added another deadly layer. These heavy iron grills could be dropped in seconds, often trapping attackers in the murder zone just as defenders unleashed their barrage. Some castles even featured double portcullises, creating a deadly trap between them. Once enemies were caught in this iron cage, survival was unlikely. Beyond brute defenses, deception played a subtle but powerful role. False doors and dead-end corridors were sometimes incorporated into castle designs. Invaders unfamiliar with the layout could become lost or trapped in these mazes while defenders regrouped or launched ambushes. Likewise, hidden passageways, known as postern gates or sally ports, allowed defenders to slip outside unseen. Small and well-concealed, these exits enabled surprise attacks against besieging forces, often at night or during storms when vigilance waned. Moats served more than just the practical function of preventing tunneling or ramming. Filled with water, they turned the approach into a treacherous crossing. Scaling ladders and siege towers became difficult to position, and any invaders who fell into the moat risked drowning while under fire from the walls. In colder climates, defenders sometimes broke the ice, turning a frozen moat into a deadly trap for advancing troops. Inside the castle, more subtle traps existed. Defensible staircases wound clockwise as they ascended towers. This seemingly small architectural choice gave right-handed defenders, who carried swords in their right hands, more room to strike downward, while attackers, ascending awkwardly, struggled to swing their weapons effectively. Narrow and steep, these stairs became sites of brutal close-quarters combat during breaches. Even psychological tricks were employed. Defenders often paraded their banners and made noisy displays of confidence to convince besiegers that morale remained high, even if food and hope were running low. At times, they staged fake reinforcements or sent out small raiding parties to give the illusion of strength. For invaders, unsure of how long their supplies and resolve would last, such tactics sowed doubt. The ingenuity of castle defenders was born from necessity. Every trick, trap, and deception served a singular goal: to protect those within. As sieges stretched on, it became clear that battles were fought not just with swords and stones but with clever minds. The defenders had to think like hunters, turning the castle itself into a deadly snare. In this deadly game of patience and strategy, sometimes outwitting the enemy proved more powerful than outlasting them. When cunning and courage worked together, castles became nearly invincible, strongholds of not only stone but also intellect. A siege was rarely a quick affair. Weeks turned into months, and sometimes even years. As each side struggled for dominance, both attackers and defenders faced harsh realities. Hunger, disease, and exhaustion chipped away at armies outside the walls and communities trapped within. But the end of every siege was inevitable. One side would eventually break. For the attackers, victory often required overwhelming force or ingenuity. Sometimes, after prolonged bombardment and assaults, a weak point would be exposed. A section of the wall might crumble under repeated strikes from trebuchets or early cannon fire. Sappers, soldiers trained to dig tunnels beneath walls and collapse them, could undermine even the thickest fortifications if left unchecked. When breaches occurred, brutal assaults followed. Invaders poured into gaps with ferocity, desperate to break the defenders' spirit and capture the castle. For the defenders, these moments were the most desperate and heroic. They fought back fiercely in narrow passages and on staircases, using every advantage the castle's design afforded them. Even women and children took up arms or aided the wounded, knowing that surrender could mean massacre. Not every siege ended in slaughter. In many cases, if defenders saw no hope of victory, they negotiated terms of surrender. Honor was deeply woven into medieval warfare. A garrison that resisted bravely but yielded before total collapse might be spared or allowed to leave peacefully. However, if defenders resisted to the bitter end and were overrun, the consequences were often catastrophic. Looting, destruction, and execution were not uncommon. Sometimes, salvation came from beyond the walls. Relief forces, often summoned from allied lords or the king, could arrive to break the siege. The sudden arrival of fresh troops could turn the tide, forcing besiegers to abandon their positions and retreat. In many legendary sieges, such as those during the 100 Years' War, last-minute rescues saved castles that seemed doomed to fall. As warfare advanced through the late Middle Ages and into the Renaissance, the once impregnable castle began to lose its dominance. Gunpowder and cannon technology advanced rapidly. Walls that once shrugged off arrows and stones crumbled under explosive bombardment. Castles became vulnerable in ways they never had been before. By the 15th and 16th centuries, military architecture began to shift. Star forts and bastioned fortifications, with lower, angled walls designed to deflect cannon fire, replaced the high walls and towers of medieval castles. The romantic image of knights defending soaring battlements faded into history, replaced by the grim realities of gunpowder warfare. Yet, even as their military value declined, castles retained their symbolic power. They became administrative centers, noble residences, and later, romantic ruins that captured the imagination of poets, painters, and historians. Some were maintained and modernized, while others were abandoned to time. Today, they stand across Europe and beyond, silent yet powerful reminders of an age when stone walls and human resolve shaped the fate of kingdoms. The legacy of medieval castle defense endures not merely in ruined towers or weathered battlements, but in the stories of courage, ingenuity, and endurance. Every murder hole, every hidden postern gate, every arrow slit speaks of desperate days and sleepless nights, when communities united behind walls that promised, and often delivered, salvation. In the end, it was not just stone and mortar that defended medieval castles. It was the will of the people within, the knights ready to die at the gatehouse, the archers loosing arrows under a hail of return fire, the cooks and healers tending the weak, and the lords and commanders who refused to yield. Together, they formed a human shield stronger than any wall. Their legacy lives on, echoing in the silent ruins and in the tales passed down through generations, stories of resistance, resilience, and the eternal human desire to protect what is theirs, no matter the cost. The battle drums have faded, and the stone walls now stand silent. But the legacy of medieval castles, and the brave defenders who made them impenetrable, still echoes through time. Their stories of resilience, strategy, and sacrifice continue to inspire and fascinate us today. If you enjoyed this journey back into history, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts below. Which castle defense surprised you the most? Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next captivating story from the past.